want to talk a bit about people's actions, behaviors, and some of the value system around that. And in some ways, you can think of it kind of simply, right? That there's a spectrum, and it's a spectrum of, selfishness versus selflessness. And so on one end of the spectrum, you have people who act in such a way or whose values are such that they optimize for themselves. Literally everything they do is geared around their own pleasure, their own happiness, their own benefit. Even if it hurts other people at the expense of other people, it doesn't matter, right? It's the extreme end of that spectrum, whatever it takes by any means necessary to get what they want. And when it comes to making decisions, they do things that benefit them in every way possible. Very rarely do they make hard choices, sacrifices, if at all, right? It's all about them at all times. Then as you kind of move along that spectrum, you have some people that think similarly, perhaps. They are out for themselves. They want to benefit themselves. They want to maximize or optimize their own happiness or pleasure, but they're not willing to hurt other people, right? They'll do whatever it is they need to do to maximize their own pleasure, as long as it's not hurting somebody else, right? So there's a bit of sacrifice there. It's relatively minimal, and I'd say a good chunk of people, at worst, kind of fall into that category. They have some kind of moral guidelines or value system that says, even if I might want to, right? Ultimately, it would be great if I could do anything I wanted just for me or maximize my own pleasure. For various reasons, societal norms, religious norms, different things like that, legal norms, they recognize they can't do that, and they kind of keep themselves in check. So they do make some sacrifices, but in some ways it's almost still selfish. Like they're trying to maintain an image or who they are, but it at least functions in society. So you have that category. Then you have people who are willing to help other people to an extent. It's not all just about them, but typically they'll do it when it's convenient or easy, right? If it's not going to hurt them too much and they could help other people, if there's a way in which they're still getting benefit and pleasure out of it, but it also helps other people, then that's great. And they recognize that, right? They see the value in that. You contrast that to people in the other end of the spectrum, we spoke about, that are super selfish. They don't even consider that. They don't see any value in it. It's a waste of time to try and benefit somebody else, to sacrifice themselves, or even if it's a win-win, right? It doesn't matter to them. They're just laser focused on themselves. So versus this third category I speak of, which is much closer to the middle, starts to even move to the other side, is there's a value. They place some value, some benefit on helping other people. Now you could debate whether they get some benefit from that, so it still is somewhat of a selfish act. And likely that is the case, but at least in some ways, it's a positive that they see benefit in helping others and trying to help others. But if you think about decisions you make or things you do in life, for that category of people, they're not necessarily willing to do the hard things. They're not necessarily willing to really sacrifice in some way or make hard decisions to help other people. It's ultimately still about them, but if they can help other people, great. And you kind of get the idea now as you move along the spectrum. There's probably another category of people that are willing to go a little bit further. They're willing to make some harder decisions. They're willing to do some things that maybe don't benefit them as much at all, but it helps other people, and they're willing to do that. So that's, you kind of move along that spectrum. The thing I find most interesting is what sits at the other end of that spectrum. In theory, it's true selflessness. It's the true act of saying, I would say, and perhaps one of the hardest things to do in life, to say, I'm going to make a really hard decision, but I don't have to. There's no reason for me to do it. There's no motivation. There's no compelling argument to be made for me to do it. Moreover, it might even be the case that there's actually a strong argument that says you should do the opposite, right? It's a situation where by most reasonable people's standards, you would be justified to say, I don't have to help that person at all. I could tell that person to go F off, right? Or whatever, given what they've done or given the circumstance or whatever it might be. I could even treat that person poorly. I would be totally justified and within my rights to do that, right? But in that situation, they don't have to. It's really hard for them. It's a sacrifice for you in some way, but you still do something to try and help other people. And, again, I say that's interesting and perhaps the most fascinating to me for two reasons. The one being, is it truly selfless? Does that exist? Would anybody actually do that? I've talked in a prior video about a Socrates concept that says nobody ever does anything. I'm summarizing and putting it in my own words, but everything we do, there's a cost benefit analysis. And if it spits out that it's net negative, right, the cost is too high, we don't do it. It's almost like a universal principle, I would view it as. And this is kind of challenging that. This is saying, does that exist? Does anybody look at that and say, yep, this doesn't benefit me, this hurts me, but it helps somebody else, so I'm going to do it. A truly selfless act. It makes me wonder again if that really exists. But the other thing that's interesting to me about it, and I guess it's related, is what truly is the benefit of it? Because I think these are the situations I mentioned. Perhaps the most difficult situation or decision or action for a human to make is this one, where you're doing something extremely hard that you don't have to do. You're actually justified to do the opposite. They likely have the biggest impact. They likely make the biggest difference. They likely do the most quote unquote good in the world. And you could argue that for a lot of people there's a degree of short-sightedness, or they just don't have the ability to see the big picture. So when they run their math, right, the mental math we always talk about, it comes out as if it looks like a net negative. It looks like, why would I ever do that? There's no benefit to it. But if you can look a few levels down, if you can look out a few steps, you could see, hey, this could be perhaps the most beneficial thing I could do. And you could look at all different examples and scenarios of this. Politics comes to mind right away, right? The back and forth, the tit for tat that goes on in politics, particularly in today's world, Democrat versus Republican. Nobody wants to give an inch, and they feel like they don't have to. They're completely justified to do what they do and act the way they act because the other side isn't acting right? You could look at this in individual family situations, marriages, social issues, work issues, everywhere, where somebody feels like, hey, that person's not doing the right thing. Why should I do right by them? Why should I be the bigger person? Why should I do something selfless to try and benefit others? Well, maybe that's the thing. Maybe that will make all the difference. It's related to the concept of being the change you want to see in the world, but it almost feels a step harder, right, in this category, because again, it's something extremely hard for you to do. It takes a high degree of mental toughness to actually do it. So super hard, super heavy in cost for you. And again, you don't have to do it, but you do it anyway. And you think of it in the political framework. What if somebody stood up that didn't have to and said, you know what? I don't have to embrace the other side. I don't have to try and, be the one that's the bigger person because I have every right and my base wants me to still stick it to them. My base wants me to keep, fighting and, they've done things wrong and I'm justified. But what if somebody stepped up and said, I'm going to do the hard thing. I'm going to do the selfless thing and try and fix this and try and bridge this gap. Maybe that's the thing that really makes a difference.